Welcome back. With this lecture, we shift our focus from the continent and the reformations that were taking place there to another reformation, in fact, a very unique one in many ways, unique in the process, if not necessarily unique in terms of the theology we're going to see that this particular reformation will embrace. That reformation that we're speaking of is the Reformation in England. And so let me go ahead and turn our attention to that right away, and we'll begin. At first here, what I'm going to do is give us an overview. Actually, we're going to give an overview a couple of different times, because one is an overview that's really the sort of very highest of the peaks of these events, and then we'll delve down a little bit further, and we're trying to work toward seeing the theology, which is the focus of this course. So let's start with a brief overview summary. As one author says, the bare outlines of the events that we call the English Reformation is pretty straightforward. It's a story unavoidably dominated by successive kings and queens. That is, of course, the kings and queens of England. Actually, in many ways, this Reformation, as it got going and as it progressed, was a great deal more political than it was theological. And that's pretty much true. We're going to see from the beginning to the end. And so we'll have to sort of follow these political developments and be looking for the theology sort of in between as we go. During the reign of Henry VIII, England broke away from the papacy, from the Roman Catholic Church, and embraced some aspects of the Protestant Reformation that was unfolding on the continent we've been studying about in previous lectures. During the short reign of his son, Edward VI, the country moved in a much more decisively Protestant direction. And before we move on here, just understand that the history that we're looking over here is following the same time frame, or happens at the same time as events on the continent. So if you look at Henry's dates there of his reign, he reigned from 1509 to 1547. Just keep in mind that the 95 Theses were nailed by Luther to the castle church door there in Wittenberg in October of 1517. So this was during Henry's reign. And Luther died in 1546, just a year before Henry died. That Reformation that was underway under Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, was promptly reversed by the Catholic Restoration under Queen Mary, as we're going to see a number of times. She's also known as Bloody Mary. But her time on the throne was short, and her attempt at Catholic restoration in England was itself overturned by a Protestant restoration under Queen Elizabeth I, not the least because of Elizabeth's longevity, and her, we're going to find out, idiosyncratic Protestant settlement, the Elizabethan settlement, but because of the fact that by that time, both politically as well as theologically, Protestantism had entrenched itself in England. Versions of this Reformation were maintained by her successors, James I. By the way, James I is the James that the King James Version of the Bible is named after, and Charles I, at least until the Civil War. And we're going to see that there was a civil war that swept King Charles I from power. He was beheaded by his opponents and pitched England's religious life into turmoil once again. Again, the politics and the theology are interwoven. Let's take a deeper, broader view here, an overview of the English Reformation. King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine. Her name is Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was Spanish. She had been married to Henry's older brother, but Henry's older brother died. And when the time came, Henry was old enough. He and Catherine were married, although she was a number of years already older than him. but she did not produce a male heir. And Henry recognized that he needed to have a male heir to his throne, and so he asked the Roman Catholic Church to grant a divorce from Catherine so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. But the Catholic Church refused to let him do this. Henry therefore decreed that the church in England was now under his control, and not that of the Pope. So again, it's a political thing. What had been achieved in other countries through endless preaching and struggle happened in England through royal decree and in a series of measures passed in Parliament in the 1530s. The king simply took control of the existing Catholic structures, demolished the monasteries, executed anyone who, like Sir Thomas More, refused to renounce their allegiance to the Pope, and basically, in a sort of tyrannical way, managed to produce something like an English Reformation. His advisors, much more genuinely evangelical and Protestant than Henry, Thomas Cranmer, and we'll get to know him, and Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was an evangelical, but he didn't do theology, he did the political things. Both of these men were sympathetic to Lutheranism, or Protestantism, as you will, and the new Church of England was formed along broadly Protestant lines. However, because there were no rival churches in the country, the Church of England never became as strident, that is, nobody argued their theological points as strongly, or as definitive, that is, dogmatic, about its beliefs as did the continental churches that we've seen, Lutheran and Reformed. Despite a brief blip in the 1550s when Queen Mary, again Bloody Mary, tried to reestablish Roman Catholicism, as we've noted, and she executed an enormous number of Protestants, and the famous Fox's Book of Martyrs is mostly about the reign of Bloody Mary. Still, the Church of England managed to remain secure. It didn't succumb to going back to Roman Catholicism, and as we're going to see, that was in large measure because of the work, the political decisions that were made by Elizabeth I. Late in the 16th and 17th centuries, under men like Richard Hooker, the Church of England would forge a distinctive theological approach, taking what they regarded as the best from Catholicism and Protestantism. But that's at the end of this century that we're talking about and into the next. It's really kind of important because I keep saying that the Reformation in England was more political than theological. It's important to understand the several motivations for reform. The motivation for reform, the Reformation of the Church in England in the 16th century, is often oversimplified when it's suggested that the only reason for it was Henry VIII's desire for a divorce so he could have a new wife. For instance, historian Roger Olson, that we've quoted quite a number of times already in this course, says this: the English Reformation began very differently than the other Protestant Reformations in Europe. As noted above, and now still quoting Olson, King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife and marry another. This was strictly forbidden by the Roman Catholic canon law, and yet Henry, a devout Catholic and ardent opponent of Protestantism, wanted a son to succeed him. So when the Pope of the day refused to grant him the divorce that Henry wanted, Henry forced Parliament to pass legislation that would make him the head of the church. And by the way, the Queen is still the head of the church, supposedly, in England, in the Anglican Church, effectively severing the English Church from the Church of Rome. Actually, that story is a bit more complex. The real story is a bit more complex than that. Henry VIII indeed wanted and needed a male heir, which his wife Catherine of Aragon, as we said, his brother's widow, had not given him. Had Catherine given birth to a son, then more than likely there wouldn't have been an English Reformation, at least not on part of Henry VIII. And the point there is that Henry's concern merely wasn't that he wanted to get rid of his old wife and find a new one. I'm sure that's part of it. He had a desire to wed Anne Boleyn. But he was really more concerned about the political stability of the realm. It was very important for a king to produce a male heir, and that hadn't happened with Catherine. Catherine was getting too old to bear children, and so it was again in part political, as well as a desire to see his kingdom more stable. Henry VIII's need for revenue was great. He needed a lot of money. He had a number of wars that didn't turn out very well for him, and a number of other things. And so he needed money. And the fact is, the church had money. The monasteries, the convents, very large dioceses, and other sources of income in the Roman Catholic Church, which, by the way, didn't go to Henry, went to the Pope if there was any excess. Since the church held huge reserves of wealth, which was exempt from taxes, that led to a quote-unquote reform. That was part of Henry's desire for reform in order to figure out some way to get the wealth from the church and feed it into the coffers of the king, which again, the aforementioned Thomas Cromwell was very good at that. And they managed to go through a series of dissolving monasteries, consolidating dioceses, and then using the proceeds, the income from them, to help support King Henry's endeavors. But even more seriously, there was a need for reform. We've seen this already in medieval Catholic England. We've seen it everywhere in Europe. There was corruption. There was a lot that wasn't really very spiritual about the Roman Catholic Church. And that was true in England as much as anywhere else, and so there was a need to reform. This is acknowledged by everyone, and especially true of the Christian humanists, which we've mentioned several times in our course. So there was also simply the fact that there are those who sincerely desired the type of Reformation that was happening in Germany under Martin Luther. You shouldn't discount that either. In fact, these are the people that basically come alongside Henry and help him accomplish what he wants in terms of Reformation, and then he in turn helps them, whether he did that wittingly or willingly or however. The Reformation in England slowly began to turn in the direction of the kind of Reformation that Martin Luther had sparked, and which the Reformed churches, as we've already talked about, had seen in places like Germany and Switzerland and others. Simple fact is, there was a desire for a more biblical New Testament church in the minds of a lot of people, and for more biblical, that is, evangelical doctrines in terms of salvation, the kinds of things that Luther was teaching. So the desire was growing in England, like it was on the continent, to have a real Reformation theologically and in terms of how the church runs, even though that probably wasn't so much on Henry's mind. It was on the mind of a lot of people, and they were the ones that were sort of fostering this Reformation, as we will see. So let's talk about the beginnings of the Reformation. We'll see the beginnings, and then we'll see the continuing reform that comes along with it. As far as number one, the English church in the early 16th century was hungry for reform. That's what we've said. But that was neither an unusual nor alarming condition. So that was what we just finished saying. Loyal and earnest, pious churchmen were painfully aware that the English church fell short of its high ideals, even though, compared realistically both to its own past and to the rest of Latin Christendom, the church in England was in pretty good shape. I mean, in terms of, there was less corruption, there was less need for serious reform in terms of doctrinal matters, because, frankly, again, the English had never really gone off the rails, so to speak, as in other places. And because, again, as we can see, the monarchs of England were a great deal stronger than the monarchies or rulers in other places. The clergy of the English church was better disciplined, better educated, and its parishes were better equipped than ever before. And its lay people, many of them, were hungry to be brought into the deeper church's life, and in many respects, that was being done. So they desired to have a richer experience in the church and in their religious life, so to speak. And in many ways, that was being done, although they thought there could be more. But for the church's most ambitious leaders, good enough was not good enough. And modest successes only underlined how much more there was to be done. By the early 16th century, this long-standing unease had begun to merge with a new movement for reform that was sweeping Christendom and which put down particularly deep roots in England. And it's what we've already mentioned, Christian humanism. Christian humanism, as historians call it, was the latest turn of the medieval spiral of reform, an attempt to apply the methods and insights of the religious Renaissance to religious life. One such humanist was Thomas More. Thomas More was a Christian humanist, still a very ardent Catholic in many ways, and the author of one very still well-known book named Utopia. But that reform and More needed someone with particular, whether political skills and practical administrative experience. The Christian humanists needed someone who could bring reform and someone who was loyal to Henry, and that man turned out to be Cardinal Archbishop Thomas Wolsey. England's Catholic Reformation had a start date, that was 1518, when Wolsey was made a papal legate, that is, was delegated the authority of the Pope to exercise the authority in England, and he was given sweeping powers to reshape the English Church. Now, Wolsey didn't necessarily have Reformation-type sympathies, but he did have reforming type sympathies, Christian humanist-type sympathies, and he was pretty good at it. Cardinal Wolsey spoke for the Pope in England and represented the King of England to the Pope. Perfect go-between guy. Wolsey's task with the Pope was to gain papal permission for general reform, to gain some concessions from the Church to address Henry's need for revenue that we mentioned earlier, and the most pressing personal issue for the king. Wolsey needed to get the Pope to grant Henry VIII an annulment for his marriage to Catherine. Now, again, this is not on the slide, so listen. The Pope at the time was a distant relative of Catherine of Aragon, so he could hardly let the king divorce his niece. I think that's the relationship. But anyway, so it was personal. Furthermore, the Catholic emperor at the time wanted to sort of keep Henry in his place. And so the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire pressured the Pope not to grant this indulgence for Henry to get this particular annulment in this divorce. So again, a lot of politics were going on behind the scenes to prevent Henry from getting what he wanted and needed. Well, long story short, Wolsey tried, but due in large part to his own concern for his own power and wealth, he was not only trying to help the king, he was trying to help himself quite a bit along the way. He failed at really both tasks. He didn't do a good job of representing the Pope to the king, and he didn't do a good job of representing the king to the Pope. And so in due time, that job passed to Wolsey's own right-hand man. Again, we mentioned this fellow already, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was committed, but not openly, to the reforms that had begun in Germany under Luther. Cromwell was, again, he was a political operative. He did have sympathies, Reformation-type sympathies, but he really didn't foster them as a theologian or as a preacher, certainly. Cromwell managed, however, to persuade Henry to adopt some moderate Protestant-leaning reforms, always in a way that would be beneficial to Henry in his various motivations. Along with Cromwell, the man who replaced Wolsey as Archbishop of Canterbury was Thomas Cranmer. Now, Cranmer's the guy that does the theology, as we're going to see. Cranmer was of Cambridge University, became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533. There was an archbishop between Wolsey and Cranmer, but he didn't serve the king very well either. So Cranmer was given the job. Cranmer legitimized Henry's divorce and remarriage along theological lines. So Cromwell legitimized the divorce and marriage on political grounds, and Cranmer legitimized the divorce and marriage on theological grounds. But Cranmer had some leanings toward sort of Lutheran and Reformational ideas. So the reform continues at the bottom of that slide. Working together, Cromwell and Cranmer worked to move Henry to accept a church that in many ways was a copy, outwardly, a copy of the Roman Catholic Church in England, but with a number of fundamental changes in doctrine and practice that Henry didn't pay that much attention to, but they managed to get these to take place in the church and keep moving the church in England in a reformational direction. Henry died in 1547, as we've already noted, and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. It's always not a good thing to have your kingdom ruled by a child, because he's not doing the ruling, somebody else is, and that's always a time that's very unstable. But fortunately, in this time, the young king's advisors and the people that were helping him out were Protestants. And Archbishop Cranmer was right in the thick of this fast-paced Protestant movement that kept things going in the right direction as far as Protestantism is concerned. Since Edward was just a child when he was made king, the government, again, as I say, was actually controlled by advisors. Many of them were committed to Protestant reforms that had been introduced and under Henry's reign, and they kept going in that direction, and Cranmer was one of these. Cranmer had spent time in Germany with Lutherans and other Protestants, and he had been convinced while he was there, and then had adopted some of those reforms that he saw there. Again, some of these things that he did openly in front of Henry VIII, and then with Edward VI blessing, because when Edward VI got old enough, he was very much influenced to be a strong Protestant. In fact, not only did Cranmer adopt some of the Reformation practices from the continent when he was there, he was married there. He had been married once before, but his wife had died. So he married another in that time, but he pretty much kept that marriage a secret for the time being. In 1549, Cranmer produced the Protestant-inspired English prayer book to be used as the uniform worship manual for the entire Church of England. He revised it as the Common Book of Prayer, as it became called, in 1552, and even though it's gone through a number of revisions since then, it's never lost its distinctive Protestant sense about it. So high churches like the Anglican Church for many years, even though it was had outward trappings that looked more like a high church, Catholic type church, still when the prayers were read, they sounded very much like sort of Protestant. England was flooded with Protestants from Europe during the brief reign of Edward VI. Many of these came from Geneva, where, of course, Calvin had been, and where Beza, his successor, was still teaching, working. And they had absorbed a number of Reformed theology ideas, Calvinism, with very different ideas of ecclesiology, that is, how the church should be run, because they were very much Protestants and chafed at the sort of Catholic outward form that Henry had retained, and even Edward VI had retained in large measure. They'd also seen a very different political system, not a monarchy, but something more like a republic. And again, in Calvin's Geneva, the magistrates of the church, along with the elders, were basically the most important political body. Again, this was the era of church and state, and so they had seen not quite a parliament, but definitely not a king. All in all, the church under Cranmer was headed toward a Protestant church with a monarch and an archbishop working hand in hand to bring about even further Protestant developments. After Edward VI died, we have already seen that his half-sister Mary became queen, as noted. She tried to wipe out Protestantism, but failed. Bloody Mary, as she was called, died in 1558 and was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth, who reigned as Elizabeth I until her death in 1603. So you can see she had a very long reign. Not as long as the current Elizabeth, but still very long reign. She was a Protestant, but she had little sympathy with Reformed theology, mostly because she was really more political than she was theological, and she saw people arguing about theology as something that just destabilized the country politically, and so she didn't want to have anything to do with hard opinions on either side. She didn't like Reformed polity again. This idea of no monarchy, that of course didn't go over very well at all. And in Scotland, especially, where a reformer that we didn't have time to develop in this course, but it would be helpful to know, John Knox, also had been in Geneva, and he went back to Scotland and brought Presbyterianism there, which is more sort of a republic form of government, certainly not a monarchy. And so Elizabeth would have none of that. That was something that she couldn't abide. What Elizabeth wanted was a via media, that is, a middle way for her church, the English church. She wanted it to be the sole church in her realm, again, because various churches she saw created strife, trying to have a strong Catholic church and a strong Protestant church, or for that matter, strong versions of the Protestant church, whether Presbyterian or even later on Congregational. She could see that was not helpful politically. And so she was willing to allow a moderate Protestant theology, but within a Catholic polity, which is a Catholic type of government, and a Catholic liturgy. The most important doctrinal elements of the Continental Reformation were permanently established in what came to be known as the Elizabethan settlement. What we mean by that is Elizabeth's Anglican Church affirmed justification by grace alone through faith alone, unequivocally, at the same time rejecting the more radical, that is, the political aspects of the European Reformed Protestantism. So it was the so-called Elizabethan settlement was something that, again, very, very important doctrinal affirmations like justification by faith alone or sola scriptura, scripture alone. Those were established, but Elizabeth didn't want to go any further than that. Elizabeth I managed to keep an uneasy balance between two sides of the church, represented by two men. The leading Anglican theologian under Elizabeth was Richard Hooker, who was raised Reformed but converted to Anglicanism. So this is a fellow that knew what the other side believed, but felt like the church needed to stay in its sort of Anglican form, that is, a sort of outwardly looks like Roman Catholic, while allowing the deeper sort of doctrine to certainly have some reformational aspects to it. On the other side was an associate minister in the same church where Hooker was a minister as well, by the way, Walter Travers, who was an ardent and outspoken Puritan critic of Anglicanism and the Elizabethan settlement. We're going to see in an upcoming lecture the relationship between Elizabeth and the Puritans. Travers and Hooker represented two sides of the Church of England that eventually began persecuting one another to such an extent that in the years ahead, after Elizabeth left, would lead ultimately to a civil war. Well, again, that went by pretty quickly. That's an overview of the events of the English Reformation, covering a long period of time, the reign of several kings and queens. And in the next lecture, we'll begin to delve a little bit more into the theology of this particular part of the Reformation.